At 2:47 in the morning, local time, in a stretch of airspace above southeastern Turkey that most people could not find on a map, something happened that has not happened in the 76-year history of the NATO alliance. A NATO integrated air defense battery, operated by Allied personnel on Turkish soil, locked onto an inbound ballistic projectile that had originated from Iranian territory, and it fired. The interceptor climbed at 3 times the speed of sound, crossed the trajectory of the incoming missile at an altitude of approximately 62,000 feet, and destroyed it. The debris fell across an unpopulated stretch of agricultural land near the Turkish-Syrian border. No one was killed. No buildings were hit. No crater. No fireball. No footage for the evening news. By sunrise, the physical evidence had already been collected by Turkish military teams and transported to a secure facility. If you were a farmer in that region and you slept through the night, you would never know. It happened. But it happened. And that single event, that one interception, that one missile turned into scattered metal fragments falling silently onto empty farmland, may be the most consequential military action taken by the Western Alliance since the end of the Cold War. Not because of the damage it caused, there was no damage. Not because of the casualties, there were none, but because of what it means, what it signals, what it sets into motion, and what it makes almost impossible to reverse. When NATO fires a weapon at an Iranian missile, a line is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. A precedent is set that cannot be unset. A door opens that cannot be closed. And on the other side of that door is a chain of obligations, escalations, responses, and counter-responses that has a very specific name in the history of international conflict. It is called an escalation spiral, and the last time the world saw an escalation spiral between major powers that reached this level of direct military contact, 60 million people died. That is not dramatic language. That is the documented historical pattern. And this video is going to show you exactly why this interception happened, what both sides are going to do next, why neither side can afford to back down, why the mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation are failing, and what all of it means for you personally, for your safety, for your economy, and for the world your children are going to inherit. Every claim will be based on documented events and verifiable patterns, and by the end you will understand something about where the world stands right now that almost no one in the media is explaining clearly. Let us start with the question that matters most and is being answered least. Why was an Iranian missile flying over Turkey in the first place? Because the answer to that question is not what you have been told. The immediate explanation, the one you will see on every news channel, is that Iran launched a missile barrage targeting assets in northern Iraq and that one or more missiles deviated from their intended trajectory and entered Turkish airspace. That is the official version. It is technically accurate, and it is profoundly misleading. Because it implies that this was an accident, a stray shot, a miscalculation, an oops moment in the fog of a regional conflict. And that framing serves a very specific purpose. It gives everyone an off-ramp. It allows NATO to say we were defending our airspace from an errant projectile. It allows Iran to say the missile was not aimed at Turkey. It allows both sides to pretend that this was not what it actually was. But here is what the trajectory data actually shows, and this is the part that the carefully worded official statements are designed to obscure. The missile that was intercepted was not on a trajectory toward northern Iraq. It was not veering off course. It was on a flight path that, if completed, would have carried it over Turkish territory at high altitude before descending toward a target further west. The interception happened not at the edge of Turkish airspace where a stray missile might accidentally cross a border. It happened deep enough inside Turkish airspace that the missile had been tracked for several minutes before the engagement decision was made. Several minutes is an eternity in missile defense. It means the system had time to classify the threat, calculate the trajectory, determine that the missile was not going to exit Turkish airspace on its own, and make a deliberate decision to fire. That is not a response to an accident, that is a response to an incursion. Now, whether Iran intended that missile to violate Turkish airspace or whether it was a genuine navigational failure is a question that may never be answered publicly. And frankly, it does not matter. Because in the world of strategic signaling, what matters is not what you intended, it is what you did, and what Iran did intentionally. Or not is send a ballistic missile into the sovereign airspace of a NATO member state, and what NATO did, deliberately and with full awareness of the consequences, is shoot it down. Those are the two facts that matter. Everything else is narrative management. And here is why those two facts are so dangerous. Because of 5 words written in 1949 that most people have heard of but very few people actually understand. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Those 5 words, an attack on one is an attack on all, are the most consequential sentence in modern military history. They are the reason the Cold War never became a hot war. They are the reason the Soviet Union never invaded Western Europe. They are the reason that for 76 years, no nation on earth has dared to directly attack a NATO member state. Because those 5 words mean that an attack on Turkey is an attack on the United States, on Britain, on France. On Germany, on all 32 member nations simultaneously, it means that the full military power of the most powerful alliance in human history is pledged to respond. Now, the obvious question, does this incident trigger Article 5? And the answer is, it depends on who you ask, and that ambiguity is itself the crisis. Tell me in the comments, before this video, did you understand what Article 5 actually commits NATO nations to do? And did you realize that the decision about whether a specific incident qualifies is not automatic but political, made by human beings in a room who may have very different opinions about what should happen next, because that political dimension is where the real danger lies? Let me explain why, because this is the part that the media covers badly every single time. Article 5 has been invoked exactly once in NATO's entire history, on September 12, 2001. The day after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, every NATO member declared that the attack on the United States was an attack on all of them, and that invocation led directly to the war in Afghanistan, a war that lasted 20 years and involved military forces from dozens of NATO nations. That is the precedent. That is the weight of those 5 words. And the fact that Article 5 has only been used once in 76 years tells you how seriously every NATO government takes the decision to invoke it. It is not a light switch you flip casually. It is a nuclear option in diplomatic terms. Once it is invoked, the entire alliance is legally and politically committed to a collective military response. And once that commitment is made, walking it back without responding is more dangerous than responding, because it destroys the credibility of the entire alliance. This is the trap that this interception has created. Turkey is now in a position where it has clear evidence that a foreign military projectile violated its sovereign airspace. It has evidence that the projectile originated from Iran. It has evidence that NATO air defenses engaged and destroyed the projectile under normal circumstances. Any nation whose airspace is violated by a foreign military weapon would consider that an act of war. Turkey has every legal and political right to invoke Article 5, and there is a faction within the Turkish government and military that is pushing hard to do exactly that. But invoking Article 5 against Iran is not the same as invoking it against a non-state terrorist organization. Iran is a nation of 88 million people with a large conventional military, a sophisticated missile arsenal, a network of proxy forces across the entire Middle East, and the backing of both Russia and China. And Article 5 response against Iran would not be a targeted counterterrorism operation. It would be the beginning of a conflict between NATO and a major regional power with global implications that dwarf anything the alliance has dealt with since its founding. Every NATO government understands this, and that is why the political debate happening right now behind closed doors is so intense and so consequential. There are 3 factions inside NATO right now, and their positions are irreconcilable. Faction 1 says invoke Article 5 immediately. Their argument is straightforward and has historical logic behind it. If NATO does not respond to a direct violation of a member state's airspace by a foreign military weapon, then Article 5 means nothing. And if Article 5 means nothing, then NATO means nothing. And if NATO means nothing, then every nation in Europe and every American ally in the world loses the security guarantee that has kept the peace for nearly 8 decades. The cost of not responding, they argue, is greater than the cost of responding, because not responding invites every adversary on Earth to test NATO's boundaries, knowing that the alliance will not follow through on its core commitment. This faction includes several Eastern European member states who view any erosion of Article 5 as a direct threat to their own survival, given their proximity to Russia. Faction 2 says do not invoke Article 5 under any circumstances. Their argument is equally logical. Iran did not deliberately attack Turkey. The missile was likely an errant projectile from a strike aimed at targets in Iraq. Invoking Article 5 over what may be an accident would be a catastrophic overreaction that drags the entire alliance into a war that no member state actually wants to fight. The consequences of a NATO-Iran conflict would include a massive spike in global energy prices, a potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the activation of Iranian proxy forces against Western targets across the Middle East and potentially in Europe itself, and the very real possibility of drawing Russia and China into a wider confrontation. This faction includes Germany, which depends heavily on stable energy markets, and several Western European nations whose publics have zero appetite for another military engagement in the Middle East. Faction 3, and this is the faction that is currently winning the internal debate, says find a middle path. Condemn the violation, demand an explanation from Iran, reinforce air defenses in Turkey, issue a formal NATO statement that stops short of invoking Article 5 but explicitly warns that any future violation will trigger the full weight of the alliance's collective defense commitment. This faction is led primarily by the United States and Britain, who want to maintain the credibility of Article 5 without actually having to act on it right now. Their calculation is that a strong statement plus visible military reinforcement sends the necessary message, without crossing the threshold into active conflict. But here is the problem with the middle path, and this is the part that should genuinely concern you. The middle path only works if Iran cooperates. If Iran issues a quiet apology, acknowledges the airspace violation, offers compensation, and takes visible steps to prevent a recurrence, then the middle path holds, the crisis de-escalates. Everyone goes home, headlines move on, but Iran is not going to do that, and here is why. The new Iranian leadership, the strategic transformation that we have discussed in previous breakdowns on this channel, has fundamentally changed how Tehran responds to international pressure. The old Iran, the Iran of angry speeches and symbolic gestures, might have quietly accepted a face-saving resolution. The new Iran is playing a completely different game. The new leadership views every Western response as a data point, a test, an experiment to measure exactly where the red lines actually are versus where the West says they are, and the middle path response from NATO gives Iran exactly the data point it was looking for. It tells Tehran that a missile can violate NATO airspace, be shot down by NATO defenses, and the consequence is a strongly worded statement and some additional radar equipment. That is not a deterrent, that is an invitation. If this analysis is connecting pieces that you have not seen connected anywhere else, alike helps this reach the people who need to understand what is actually happening right now. Now let me show you the next layer, because the Turkey dimension is only the surface of this story. Let me explain why Turkey specifically is the most dangerous possible location for this incident to have occurred, because Turkey is not a normal NATO member. Turkey is the single most strategically complex and internally contradicted member of the entire alliance, and the way Turkey responds to this crisis will determine not just the future of NATO's relationship with Iran, but the future of NATO itself. Turkey is a NATO member that has purchased Russian air defense systems, the S-400, against the explicit demands of the United States. Turkey is a NATO member that has conducted military operations against American-backed Kurdish forces in Syria. Turkey is a NATO member whose president has publicly threatened to block NATO expansion, has imprisoned more journalists than almost any other country on Earth, and has maintained diplomatic and economic relationships with both Russia and Iran that many other NATO members view as incompatible with alliance solidarity. Turkey is simultaneously NATO's most important strategic asset in the Middle East and its most unreliable partner. And now Turkey is the NATO member whose airspace was just violated by an Iranian missile, which means the most complex, most unpredictable, most strategically volatile member of the alliance is now at the center of the most dangerous crisis the alliance has faced in decades, and Turkey's president has domestic political reasons to escalate this crisis regardless of what NATO as a whole wants to do. His political position depends on projecting strength. His base demands a forceful response, and the opposition is already accusing him of being too weak in his response to a foreign military violation of Turkish sovereignty, the domestic political pressure inside. Turkey is pushing toward escalation at the exact moment when every other NATO capital is desperately trying to de-escalate. This is the structural problem that nobody is talking about publicly. NATO operates on consensus. Every major decision requires agreement from all 32 member states. That system works well when interests are aligned. It breaks down completely when one member state has domestic political incentives that are diametrically opposed to the strategic preferences of the rest of the alliance. And right now, Turkey's domestic politics and NATO's strategic interests are on a collision course. Now let me broaden the frame further, because this incident did not happen in isolation. It happened against the backdrop of a Middle Eastern strategic landscape that has been fundamentally reshaped in the last several months, and understanding that landscape is essential to understanding why this crisis is more dangerous than it appears. Iran's missile programs have undergone a qualitative transformation that most Western publics are completely unaware of. For decades, Iranian missiles were relatively inaccurate, relatively short-range, and relatively easy for advanced air defense systems to intercept. That is no longer the case. Iran has developed and deployed new missile variants with significantly improved accuracy, extended range, and terminal maneuverability that makes interception substantially more difficult. The missile that was shot down over Turkey was intercepted successfully, but the interception was not easy. It required the most advanced air defense system deployed in that region, operating at peak performance with optimal engagement geometry against a salvo of multiple missiles, some with decoy capabilities and maneuvering warheads. The calculus changes dramatically. One missile can be intercepted. 20 missiles fired simultaneously at different trajectories overwhelm the defense, and Iran has thousands of missiles. This is the military reality that underpins the political crisis. NATO can defend against individual incidents. It cannot defend against a sustained missile campaign without going to war, and going to war with Iran means accepting casualties, economic disruption, and escalation risks that no NATO government has prepared its population for. The gap between what NATO can do militarily and what NATO publics are willing to accept politically is the single biggest vulnerability in the entire Western strategic posture right now, and Iran knows it. Let me now explain the Russian and Chinese dimension, because this is where the crisis transforms from a regional incident into a potential global confrontation. Russia has been watching this situation with intense strategic interest. Moscow's calculation is straightforward. Every NATO military resource that is committed to the Middle East is a resource that is not available for the European theater. Every unit of political attention that is consumed by the Iran crisis is attention that is not focused on the situation along NATO's eastern border. A prolonged NATO-Iran confrontation is, from Russia's perspective, a strategic gift. It divides Western attention, strains alliance cohesion, and creates opportunities for Russian action in theaters where Western vigilance has been reduced. Russia has been watching this situation with intense strategic interest. Moscow's calculation is straightforward. Every NATO military resource that is committed to the Middle East is a resource that is not available for the European theater. Every unit of political attention that is consumed by the Iran crisis is attention that is not focused on the situation along NATO's eastern border. A prolonged NATO-Iran confrontation is, from Russia's perspective, a strategic gift. It divides Western attention, strains alliance cohesion, and creates opportunities for Russian action in theaters where Western vigilance has been reduced. But Russia's involvement goes deeper than passive observation. Russia has provided Iran with advanced military technology, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. The air defense systems that protect Iranian nuclear facilities include Russian origin components. The satellite intelligence that informs Iranian targeting decisions includes data shared through Russian channels. Russia is not a neutral observer of this crisis. It is a participant, an indirect participant, but a participant nonetheless. And any NATO military action against Iran risks killing Russian military advisors, destroying Russian origin equipment, and triggering a Russian response that transforms a regional conflict into a global one. China's position is equally consequential. Beijing has invested billions of dollars in Iranian energy infrastructure as part of the accelerated cooperation agreement that was signed in recent months. Chinese companies operate in Iranian oil fields. Chinese banks process Iranian financial transactions. Chinese technology is embedded in Iranian communications infrastructure. A NATO military campaign against Iran would directly threaten Chinese economic interests, Chinese citizens working in Iran, and Chinese strategic investments that Beijing views as essential to its long-term energy security. China has not publicly stated what it would do in the event of a Western military attack on Iran. That ambiguity is deliberate, and that deliberate ambiguity is itself a form of deterrence, because it forces NATO planners to account for the possibility of Chinese involvement without being able to assess its probability. This is the web that this single interception is tangled in. A missile is shot down over Turkey. Turkey demands a NATO response. NATO is divided on what that response should be. Iran refuses to back down because backing down would undermine the strategic posture its new leadership has spent months building. Russia sees an opportunity to distract and divide the West. China sees a threat to its investments in energy security. And every single one of these actors is making decisions based on their own interests, their own domestic pressures, their own strategic calculations, without any mechanism for coordination or de-escalation that all parties trust. This is how world wars start, not with a single dramatic event, not with a madman pressing a button, but with a web of obligations, interests, alliances, and miscalculations that create a situation where every actor is behaving rationally from their own perspective, but the collective outcome is catastrophic. This is exactly the pattern that led to the First World War. A single incident in Sarajevo triggered a chain of alliance obligations that dragged every major power in Europe into a conflict that none of them had planned for and none of them could stop once it started. The structural parallels between that moment and this moment are not perfect, but they are close enough to be deeply alarming to anyone who studies these patterns seriously. Drop your answer in the comments. Do you believe that the alliance mechanisms and diplomatic channels that exist today are strong enough to prevent this kind of escalation spiral? Or do you think the international system is structurally vulnerable to the same kind of cascading failure that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? I want your honest assessment. Now let me tell you what this means for you, because this crisis is not an abstraction. It is a direct threat to your economic well-being and your physical safety regardless of where you live. If this crisis escalates, even to a level well short of full-scale war, the economic consequences hit immediately. Energy markets are already pricing in increased risk. Oil futures have moved upward since the interception was reported. Natural gas prices in Europe, where Turkey is a critical transit hub for energy pipelines from the Caucasus and Central Asia, have spiked. Every dollar increase in oil prices translates directly into higher gasoline costs, higher heating costs, higher transportation costs, and higher prices for every good that is manufactured, shipped, or delivered using fossil fuels, which is effectively everything. But the energy price impact is only the first-order effect. The second-order effect is financial market volatility. Defense stocks rise. Consumer stocks fall. Technology stocks fluctuate wildly as investors try to assess whether the crisis will escalate or de-escalate. Bond yields move as governments signal increased military spending. Currency markets shift as capital flows towards safe havens. If you have a retirement account, a pension, a 401,000, or any investment in any market anywhere in the world, this crisis is affecting the value of your savings right now, not tomorrow, right now. The third order effect is the one that takes longer to manifest but is ultimately the most damaging. Sustained geopolitical instability erodes business confidence. Companies delay investment decisions, hiring slows, supply chains that were already fragile from previous disruptions become even more vulnerable. The economic recovery that has been slowly building momentum gets undermined by a crisis of confidence that feeds on itself. Consumers spend less because they are uncertain. Businesses invest less because consumers are spending less. Growth slows. Tax revenues decline. Government deficits increase, and the entire cycle reinforces itself downward. This is not theoretical. This is the documented economic pattern that has followed every major geopolitical crisis of the last 50 years. The 1973 oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 1990 Gulf War, the 2003 Iraq invasion, the 2014 Russia-Ukraine crisis. Every single time, the same pattern. Energy spike, market volatility, confidence erosion, growth slowdown. The only variable is magnitude, and the magnitude of this crisis, if it escalates, has the potential to exceed anything we have seen since the 1970s. And then there is the human dimension. If NATO is drawn into a sustained military confrontation with Iran, American service members will be deployed. European service members will be deployed. Turkish forces are already on the front line. The human cost of a conflict with Iran would be measured not in the hundreds but in the thousands. Potentially tens of thousands, given Iran's military capabilities, its geographic advantages, its asymmetric warfare doctrine, and the network of proxy forces that would activate across the entire region the moment Western forces engaged. Every one of those casualties is a family destroyed, a community diminished, a cost that no economic analysis can capture and no political speech can justify after the fact. Now let me give you the three scenarios that are actually being discussed by the people who make these decisions, not the television scenarios, not the click-generating predictions, the real options that are on the table right now in the rooms where this crisis is being managed. Scenario 1 is the controlled de-escalation. Turkey accepts a diplomatic resolution. Iran provides a technical explanation for the airspace violation. NATO issues a strong statement but takes no military action beyond reinforcing Turkish air defenses. Both sides declare victory to their domestic audiences. The crisis fades from the headlines within 2 weeks. This is the scenario that every rational actor on every side prefers. It is also the scenario that requires every actor to behave rationally simultaneously, which history suggests is the least reliable assumption you can make during a crisis. Scenario 2 is the sustained standoff. Neither side escalates to direct military conflict, but neither side de-escalates either. Turkey maintains a heightened military posture on its border. NATO deploys additional assets to the eastern Mediterranean. Iran continues its missile operations in Iraq and Syria, carefully avoiding Turkish airspace but making clear that it will not be deterred by the interception. The crisis becomes a permanent state of tension, a new normal, like the Korean DMs or the line of control in Kashmir. A frozen conflict that is never resolved but never erupts into full-scale war. The risk of this scenario is that frozen conflicts have a historical tendency to thaw at the worst possible moment. A single miscalculation, a single accident, a single rogue commander making an unauthorized decision, and the frozen conflict becomes an inferno overnight. Scenario 3 is the spiral. Turkey invokes Article 5. NATO is forced to respond. The response is initially limited, a retaliatory strike against Iranian missile infrastructure. Iran retaliates against NATO assets in the region. Proxy forces activate across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Energy markets collapse. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a combat zone. Russia and China issue warnings. Diplomatic channels break down. Escalation feeds on itself. Each side responds to the other's response, and with each cycle the stakes get higher and the options get fewer. This is the scenario that nobody wants and everybody fears, and the terrifying truth about escalation. Spirals is that they do not require anyone to want them. They only require the absence of someone strong enough and credible enough to stop them. Let me tell you which scenario I believe is most likely, and why my assessment should worry you even if I am right. I believe Scenario 1 is the most likely outcome of this specific incident. The incentives for de-escalation are strong on all sides. Neither NATO nor Iran wants a full-scale war. Turkey's president, for all his rhetoric, understands that invoking Article 5 carries risks that could backfire catastrophically on Turkey itself. The diplomatic machinery, while creaking and strained, still functions. I believe this particular crisis will be managed. But here is why that should not comfort you, because this crisis is not the last one. It is one in a series, and the series is accelerating. Each incident is slightly more serious than the last. Each response is slightly more forceful. Each de-escalation is slightly harder to achieve, the distance between where we are and where scenario. 3 begins is shrinking with every cycle, and at some point the distance will shrink to 0. Not because anyone decided to start a war, but because the accumulated pressure of dozens of managed crises finally exceeds the capacity of the system to manage one more. That is the pattern that history teaches us. Wars do not start when someone decides to start a war. Wars start when the system that prevents war fails, and the system that prevents war is not a machine. It is a collection of human beings making decisions under pressure with incomplete information and competing incentives. That system works until it does not. And when it stops working, it stops suddenly, completely, and irreversibly. This is why understanding these events matters, not because any single incident is likely to trigger catastrophe, but because the pattern of incidents is trending in a direction that makes catastrophe increasingly probable over time. And the people whose job it is to prevent that catastrophe are running out of tools, running out of credibility, and running out of room. The missile that was shot down over Turkey landed in an empty field. No one was hurt, nothing was destroyed, and within hours, both sides were already crafting the language that would allow everyone to move on. On the surface, this is a minor incident, a footnote, a blip in the endless stream of Middle Eastern tensions that most people have learned to tune out. But underneath the surface, something shifted. A line was crossed, a precedent was set, a door was opened, and the people whose job it is to keep that door closed are standing in front of it with increasingly tired arms, pushing against a pressure that grows stronger with every passing month. They have held it closed before. They may hold it closed this time, but the pressure is not decreasing. It is building, and one day, maybe not today, maybe not this year, but one day their arms will not be strong enough. That is not a prediction. That is a pattern, the oldest and most reliable pattern in the history of human conflict. Pressure builds, systems strain, managers manage until they cannot, and then the world changes overnight, and everyone who was not paying attention wonders how it happened so fast, and everyone who was paying attention knows it was never fast. It was slow, agonizingly, visibly, predictably slow, right up until the moment it was not. The question is not whether you should be worried. The question is whether you are paying attention, because the people who pay attention are the ones who prepare, and the people who prepare are the ones who survive, not just physically, economically, strategically, psychologically, the people who understand what is happening before. It happens are the ones who make decisions based on reality rather than headlines, and in a world where the gap between reality and headlines grows wider every single day, that understanding is not just valuable, it is essential. Understanding geopolitics is not about predicting the exact moment when the system fails. Nobody can do that. Not analysts, not intelligence agencies, not artificial intelligence. Understanding geopolitics is about recognizing the pattern, seeing the pressure build, hearing the creaking of the structure, and making sure that when the structure groans a little louder than usual, you are not standing underneath it. That is what this channel is built for. Not to scare you, not to sensationalize, not to generate clicks through fear, but to show you the pattern clearly enough that you can make your own decisions about what it means and what you should do about it. Because in a world of managed crises and controlled narratives, the most radical thing you can do is understand what is actually happening. If you made it to the end of this breakdown, you now understand more about the structural dynamics of NATO, the strategic logic of Iranian escalation, and the economic mechanisms that connect a missile over Turkey to the price of gas at your local station than most people who will spend tonight arguing about this on social media. That is not a small thing. In a world that is designed to keep you reacting, you just spent 40 minutes thinking, and thinking, real sustained critical thinking about complex problems, is the one capability that no algorithm can replicate, no government can suppress, and no crisis can take away from you. Subscribe if you have not already. Every video on this channel is built to give you exactly this level of depth, exactly this level of honesty, and exactly this level of respect for your intelligence. The next breakdown covers what happens inside NATO when the consensus model breaks down, how alliance fractures have historically led to the very conflicts they were designed to prevent, and why the next 6 months may determine whether the Western alliance holds together or begins to fragment. That video connects directly to everything you just learned. It will be on screen the moment it is ready. This has been an Atlas Geopolitical Analysis. All content is educational commentary and opinion based on historical patterns and publicly available information.